Hello, I'm Todd Johnson, and this is Earlylands in Conversation. For this episode of the podcast, we turn our attention back to Africa and roll back the clock to the 19th century. Our guest today is Professor Richard Reid of St. Cross College, Oxford. Richard is a specialist in 19th and 20th century African history and author of the 2025 book, The African Revolution, A History of the Long 19th Century. In the book, Richard makes the case for a new lens through which to view African history, notably arguing that the infamous Scramble for Africa and the follow-on period of colonialism can't be understood without an in-depth appreciation of Africa's own transformative 19th century, independent of Europe, which witnessed new economic patterns and political systems and novel forms of warfare and violence. The book has met high critical praise, ranging from Foreign Affairs calling it an authoritative survey to the Irish Times labeling it clever, full of ideas and insights, and stimulating, as well as provocative. If you enjoyed this and our other episodes, please like and subscribe. We are pleased to welcome Professor Richard Reid to Earlylands in Conversation. Richard, thank you very much for joining us today. I presume we're catching you on campus. Is that right?
Yeah, Oxford doesn't really have a campus, but we're in a big humanities building.
Let's jump straight into it. We've got a lot of questions today, and it's a book that demands hours of discussion, or probably a course of its own. But I want to start with where the book actually starts, and you do a lovely job of focusing in the first few pages about your journey as a historian. And so the opening chapter I found really striking because you take the reader on your personal journey into how you became captivated by Africa's past. Help our listeners understand what drew you to the continent, how your intellectual interest evolved, and then how you ended up sitting in the office in which you're at right now on the campus in Oxford.
It started so long ago, it's very hard to remember, to be
Yeah,
honest. But yeah, I think I had an inspirational undergraduate tutor. I went to university not to actually study African history.
sure.
In fact, it was very low on my list. Back in the days, you could rank your preferences, and mine, African history, is at the bottom. But I was put on that course, and it blew me away. And I couldn't understand why I hadn't encountered this history before.
Right.
It certainly wasn't taught at school, and it just something magical happened. I put in graduate applications. Eventually, I was lucky to get funding, and I just took it from there. But I mean, it was really this incredibly rich history that I had never encountered before, and it was kind of bound up with anti-racist agenda as well, as most of us were motivated by that kind of thing as well when we entered into the field of African history. And here I am. I mean, I didn't come straight to Oxford. I've moved around a little bit, but the last few years I've been here.
There are certain trends, of course, like in any academic discipline. But the study of sort of colonial and pre-colonial African history, is it having a moment now, or is it always been a bit on the periphery? Help us understand kind of where it fits in the historiography of Africa. Speaking of really kind of pre-1900.
Well, I mean, I think it's still pretty much a minority sport, I would say. I
Right,
mean,
right.
when I first turned up to do graduate study in London in 1993, um, we were a pretty big cohort, and I was the only person who was doing pre-1900 history. Everyone else was doing colonial or early post-colonial history, and it's by no means completely moribund. If you look at the bibliography of the book that we're talking about today, you'll see that there's an absolute ocean of material. I think the center of gravity in the academy has shifted very much into the 20th century, and you get relatively few people really doing hard work on anything that we broadly define as pre-colonial. And that's really been the case since the 1980s, I would say.
Credit to you because, like you say, I mean, just such a fascinating and deep vein
Well,
of
I'm
history
also
there.
just bloody minded. So, yeah.
Yeah, I'm glad of it. So, well, let's get into the big argument of the book. You contend that Africa's long 19th century was a period of revolutionary ferment, violent creativity and political innovation, driven primarily by African dynamics, not European ones. And you argue that the scramble for Africa cannot be understood without appreciating these sort of indigenous transformations. So, can you lay out the central thesis for the listeners and explain what you mean by calling this period and the book an African revolution?
You've laid it out pretty effectively, Todd. I mean, the idea that's been with me for quite a long time was that this was an incredibly transformative era. And as I mentioned, I mean, because the center of gravity in the academy has shifted toward the colonial, that this amazing period that I encountered as an undergraduate has become sort of prelude. Everything's leading to the scramble for Africa. Everything's leading to the kind of creation of colonial states, so on. And the central thesis is really an attempt to rebalance that. And it argues for extraordinary changes across the continent, politically, socially, militarily, economically, and an attempt to contextualize the scramble, which of course involves some very aggressive European intrusions. But those intrusions really come on the back of and can take advantage of some of the remarkable changes which have taken place. Really, you can you can quibble over, how long is the 19th century, but I mean, it begins in the sort of 1780s, 1790s as far as this book's concerned. And it's an attempt to kind of understand African dynamics as being, in many ways, a change being internally driven, not simply a response to external stimuli. There are
Right.
lots of external stimuli in this period, of course, mostly for most of the period economically. But this is a period of remarkable innovation, state building, state collapse, state reinvention, societies that may not qualify for the term state, um, but remaking themselves and building remarkable political and military orders as a result.
It was hard to argue with your thesis after reading the book, right? But I realize you're breaking new ground. One of the most distinctive features of the book is the structure around a single stretch of road in what is now Tanzania, a commercial highway running from the coast to Lake Tanganyika.
Yeah.
Why did you choose the road as this narrative entry point, and how does it function as a lens through which to tell your story?
I was introduced to the road again as an undergraduate in this inspirational course that I mentioned earlier,
Right.
and it was dealt with in 1 week. There was a kind of lecture and a seminar, and I
Like all
just
good
remember
undergraduate courses, right?
absolutely whirlwind tour of African history. And this road just stayed with me. And I've written about it a little bit in other books. I mean, sort of it's almost 20 years ago, but when I was focusing on warfare, for example, and diplomacy in East Africa, I kind of returned to it. But the idea stayed with me that no one had ever really kind of used the road to its full value, which
Right.
it's a narrative device because it's full of motion and movement. There's a number of characters along the road that illuminate some of the larger themes, and I think that allows us to humanize really some of the bigger ideas that I deal with in the book, rather than sort of plunging in and saying, there's a revolution going on. You can actually begin by looking at that road, looking at the characters along it, both African and European. It's coastal merchants as well. So it allows you a kind of specificity, but it's also exemplary, and it's dramatic, but it's fun. I struggled for a long time about in what ways I could use it, and there was an earlier iteration back in COVID times where I kind of was going to structure the whole book on this road and maybe just think about the road itself. But I think that was more of an existential crisis for me. And I ended up simply doing what I've done, which is you've got a series of kind of little acts, as I call them, that introduce particular characters as well as themes.
You mentioned there the work that you've done on warfare in Africa, which as sort of an armchair military historian and such, I'm always excited to see others in the academy who choose the sort of forgotten discipline of military history. But go back to your earlier point about your path to African history, and then of course with this book. Tell us what led you to focus on the military side and much of your research. And the book is certainly far more than just a military history. But what led you to focus on the military component in much of your work in pre-colonial Africa?
I honestly don't know the answer to that in a straightforward way. If I had a therapist, you'd probably have to ask my therapist. I think I've always been interested in and cultures of violence, and that might be something to do with my kind of Northern Irish childhood or something. I don't know. When I was doing my graduate work on the Kingdom of Buganda, big centralized state in East Africa, one of the things that struck me was the innovations in warfare that kingdom experienced, the way it organized itself, the role of armies in political life, and so on. So it kind of that wasn't my primary focus originally when I was doing graduate work, but it sort of came out of that. And one of the things that I was trying to tackle was this enduring myth that Africans didn't really do proper war. That I don't regard myself as a military historian, by the way. There are people in this very faculty who are much better equipped
Sure, sure.
to claim that than me. But I've always been interested in militarism, the way that war is organized, and its intersection with all sorts of other walks of life, like politics and society and economy. People were often, including the first generation of historians of Africa, were very nervous about writing about warfare in Africa in the 1960s, 1970s, for example, because it seemed it ran the risk of perpetuating colonial era stereotypes about the pre-colonial past, that basically you had all these savage tribes kind of
You're
running around. That was what I was trying to tackle. I was looking for rationality and order and
right.
purpose in African warfare.
A recurring theme in the book, as you just mentioned, is this intersection of violence and creativity as well. Some reviewers of the book have noted that this emphasis on African agency through violence is a difficult line to walk, since it could be read as shifting responsibility for these terrible traumas that Africa experienced in the 19th century and early 20th century onto Africans themselves. How
Mm,
do you navigate that tension between emphasizing African agency, as you just described, their own cultures of violence and militarism, but acknowledging the very, brutal asymmetries of power that came with the colonial encounter, when German Askaris and others brought their Maxim guns onto the continent?
yeah, for sure. I mean, this caused a great deal of anxiety, as you can imagine, and many sleepless nights. Um, when I when you begin to develop the basic thesis, and I realized, well, hang on, actually, I could see down the road some people saying, but
Sure.
aren't you basically exonerating Europeans and so on? And can be a tricky line to walk. But the bottom line is that both things can be true. One doesn't rule out the other. You cannot, you don't have to load loads of responsibility onto Africans for their own partition. The argument is really about local agency versus a kind of macro strategy on the part of Europeans. At the local level, Africans have long histories of violent creativity. When Europeans, as outsiders, begin to intrude into those societies, Africans find ways of co-opting them and harnessing those forces. In the end, I mean, I think we need to be able to live with complexity and recognize that African agency is sometimes quite nuanced. And in some ways, one of the things that I was trying to tackle was this a kind of culture of monolithic resistance, which tends
Right,
to
right.
infuse a lot of 20th century writing on the Scramble, for example. That it's basically this enormous imposition, this great invasion from one continent into another. And lots of people that suits their narratives. It suits sort of post-colonial African governments to be able to say, this is the cause of our problems and so forth. When actually, the reality is a little more complex. But at no point, would I suggest or dream of suggesting that we exonerate Europeans in terms of their racial violence. That is unassailably true.
Yeah, like you say, that there's many layers of complexity here, but as you highlight in the book, some of just the sheer awfulness of the atrocities committed by colonizing powers, whether
Yeah,
they be Belgian, German, etc.
yeah,
I'm a former government leadership analyst in my time focused on Africa. So I have a particular affinity for remarkable figures, of which Africa, of course, has countless remarkable figures throughout of its past few centuries. You bring to life a number of characters: Mirambo, Tipu Tip, Henry Morton Stanley.
mm.
Who among these figures surprised you the most in your research? And, what story do you think best illustrates maybe the broader dynamics of this 19th century revolution that you describe?
That's a tough one.
Yeah, I know. That's like sort of choosing your favorite kid, right?
Yeah. I mean, I would have to go. I mean, I suppose the two characters that best exemplify what I'm trying to describe here would be Mirambo and Henry Morton Stanley. I tell my students this all the time that it sounds a bit juvenile for professional historians to have favorite characters from history, but Mirambo is definitely mine. And he surprised me the most. He surprised me when I first encountered him more than
Yeah,
30 years.
give us a character, for those who haven't read the book, give us a sort of a character snapshot.
Well, Mirambo is he is born into chiefly authority, but it's a very minor chiefdom
Right,
in west central Tanzania in around 1840. He then inherits another very small chiefdom nearby, and he amalgamates them. Um, and at some point in the 1860s, he begins to take advantage of the fact that the road that we mentioned earlier
right,
is running through his territory. And he basically builds a state from scratch. He builds a new army. He becomes a prolific trader in slaves and in ivory. Um, but he essentially creates this entity where none had existed before. And from the evidence that we're able to gather, he really only kind of enters the contemporary record in around 1870, 1871.
right,
And people who encounter him all report the same kind of thing. He's incredibly charismatic. He's very thoughtful, and he articulates visions for the region, both historical and a vision for the future, which are really remarkable. And I think that's what surprised me most, that you've actually got on record
right,
someone, articulating ideas about enhanced statehood and not war for war's sake. I mean, at some point he's on record as saying, "I don't want to be doing this. I'd rather be kind of just hunting bears in the forest or whatever." Yeah, that's
right, right. Collecting tolls from the road and, doing that sort of thing, right?
exactly. And he's this remarkable character who then dies too young. He dies in about 1884, we think, of cancer. Mm, And his state doesn't last very long after his death. But while he's around, it is the most remarkable entity, underpinned by innovations in governance and economic initiative, and as I said, military innovation as well. On the European end, I think Henry Morton Stanley is someone again who illustrates these broader dynamics. He is, on the face of it, a kind of typical Victorian explorer, riddled, of course, with racism and prejudice. But actually, he's a very displaced, yearning kind of a character. Doesn't really belong anywhere. He's a product of a striking kind of globality, which Europe is also experiencing in this period. And he finds himself marching along this road initially to go and find the missing missionary David Livingstone. And Stanley actually meets Mirambo, and they become blood brothers and so forth. And it was always that meeting. People go on about the kind of the infamous perhaps meeting between Stanley and Livingstone
Right,
in
right.
the middle of Central Africa. I always thought that it's the meeting between Mirambo and Stanley that is actually much more interesting, and that's this convergence of these strange globalizing dynamics.
You've sold me on the importance of that meeting, but you know on the convergence argument, and you make a very strong argument that Africa and Europe were experiencing parallel transformations in the 19th century, and that the scramble resulted from these trajectories colliding rather than Europe simply imposing itself on the continent, that they were both operating in tandem and they collided. Can you
Yeah.
explain that convergence argument and how we can maybe change how we think about African and European history in this period?
I thought it would be just interesting to consider these two continents in terms of convergence, because it's often assumed that there's sort of this inevitable, it's kind of a form of
Mm.
technological
Right.
determinism, I suppose, that Europe is expanding and clearly they've got better guns and better political organization and so forth. And they're going to, you know, Africa is inevitably going to be subsumed. When you read around the topic and delve into the evidence, I mean, it's very clear that there are remarkable parallels between what Europe and Africa are experiencing in the long 19th century. Europe's also a very turbulent place, experiencing socioeconomic and political upheavals. And there ends up being, I think, a great deal of reciprocity between the two continents. These relationships are very complex. Of course, we know that it ends up with extreme, in many cases, extreme racialized violence. But for a long time, European representatives in the continent developed complex, dependent relationships on the Africans with whom they interacted. There could have been no empire, European empire, in the continent without those interactions. And it's
Right.
it's really those complex relationships on which empire is built. That's what really interested me, because it struck me that if you look at the long 19th century, the century in the round, not just the last 20 years of it, um, that the building of empire is a messy business. It's complex at the local level. It's very nuanced, and that kind of zone of interaction between Europe and Africa at the local level was what drew me in, and I think allows you to extrapolate outwards the idea that here are two continents actually colliding and experiencing very similar things, if in different ways, in the course of the century.
You put your finger on, I think, when you just said there that empire, building empire is just hugely complex and there's many layers to it. And it strikes me that it is so critical to understand in so many parts of the world today, from India,
Yeah.
Southeast Asia, Africa, that understanding empire is absolutely critical. But it seems like that it's also not terribly well thought of as a discipline. Maybe I'm wrong. I just been reading the book One Fine Day by Matthew Parker. I don't know if just came out, and it's basically one day, or essentially kind of a week's period, 1923 in the British Empire, right?
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's a great sort of popular history, but a way to look at just the pervasiveness of the British Empire. And there's so many parts in the book that are compelling, but it made me wonder again: is that popular in the academy, understanding the impacts of empire, or is it still a bit not emphasized in the academy?
No, I think it is. I mean, imperial history, very broadly defined, kind of evolved quite a lot over the last kind of 50, 60 years. There would have been a point at, including at this very university that I'm sitting in, it would have been taught in very legalistic constitutional terms. What is the metropole's relationship to Nigeria or India, whatever? And it's kind of been reinvented really since the 1990s with the rise of global history
Hmm.
and increasing interest in not simply globalization, but
Yeah,
global history.
global trends, right? Or
Yeah, exactly.
yeah,
And
global
transnationality and
forces.
so forth.
Yeah,
And I think empire is very much part of that. And I think it is still, it's been reinvigorated here in Oxford. The same is true in Cambridge. I know a number of people who work on it in the US. I think there's what sometimes happens, however, is that historians of empire get a bit divorced from what is happening on the ground in places like South Asia or Sub-Saharan Africa or whatever. Those of us who have long worked on those places tend to be kind of categorized as area studies.
right, right.
And one of the other things that I tried to do in this book is to look at ways that we could, how can we bring these two disciplines, these two fields together, um, and inform one another's work. Because very often you still get imperial historians who are pretty metropolitan in
Sure.
their attitudes and
Right.
don't, really regard South Asians or Southeast Asians or Sub-Saharan Africans as kind of bit part players in this.
Right. Everything's through the lens of Whitehall or the War Office or
Yeah, yeah. And that often reflects the kinds of sources that are used.
right.
If you got an enormous pile of Foreign Office, UK Foreign Office files on this stuff. Well, I mean, that's kind of going to influence how you see the world
Sure.
if those are your major sources.
You've been doing this for 30 plus years now,
Oh my God,
focusing.
yeah.
I know. I say that about my career too. And I'm like, oh my God. But, working on one of the most fascinating regions of the world. Once you finish this book and you hit Control S for the last time, or you sent it off to your publisher, what was the one finding or connection or story that surprised you the most, or maybe fundamentally changed how you thought about Africa once you had completed the book?
Well, I think what surprised me most was that I completed the book. I think the most I think the most surprising thing really was for me was that it hadn't been done before.
Yeah, that's wh I thought that myself,
Yeah,
and it was very novel, right? But it also
yeah,
struck me as a topic that was begged to be written like
yeah,
you had,
yeah.
right?
I mean, as you are probably aware, Todd. I mean, sometimes what we do is when we've got a big book project in mind, that we often kind of write article length pieces to kind of flag up what's coming. And a few years ago, I submitted a piece to the American Historical Review, which is probably the most difficult, the most prestigious historical journal. And I fully anticipated rejection on the grounds that it wasn't very original. And that piece was kind of flagging up some of the stuff that I wanted to talk about in the book. Anyway, I mean, it got accepted and so forth after lots of revisions and so on. But I think that was the surprising thing, because the more that I kind of delved into some of the things that people had written about, and sort of begun to probe in the 1960s, 1970s, particular, but it never crystallized into a kind of more substantive revisionist movement, scholarly movement around, how do we think about empire in Africa? How do we think about this? What do we think about the scramble? It quite quickly disappeared. And yet quite a few of my brilliant forebears had actually begun to think in those ways. But I suppose in some ways it just didn't become very fashionable,
Right.
and it didn't lead anywhere. I think that's probably the most
That's
sort of
great. Well,
thing
I
that
mean, and if there's ever incentive or encouragement for young historians,
Mm,
right? That there are still so much out there to be mined, fashionable or not,
yeah.
that deserves an audience. I'd love to get your assessment. Speaking of some of the more widely read histories of Africa, I'm thinking of Thomas Pakenham's *The Scramble for Africa*, which is
Ah, yes.
probably what 45, 50 years old by now.
I think it was first published in 90 or 91, something
Oh,
like
it
that.
was 91, that's right. I think
Yeah,
maybe the Boer War, right?
yeah,
Which he had also done.
that's right.
But it's been criticized by historians for its Eurocentric framing. So more recently, there's Howard French's *Born in Blackness*, which makes
Mm.
a powerful case for Africa's centrality to the making of the modern world, really looking at the 13th, 14th, 15th, 16th century. How do you see your work in relation to these books? And I'd love to hear your opinion of these works. What are popular histories of Africa getting right and wrong?
Well, I mean, in terms of how this book relates to that, I don't know the answer to that. I mean, in some ways, unfortunately, there's still this kind of gulf between, what a university professor
Sure.
will publish as opposed to someone like Thomas Pakenham, who was a kind of incredibly, I never met him or anything, but I mean, my understanding is very erudite, gentlemanly kind of
Right.
author.
Gentleman scholar, right?
Exactly, exactly. Um, and so I suppose there's still a bit of a gulf between, the Pakenham type approach to this and our more theoretically rigid, I hope, or
Right.
evidence-based kind of work. It's still true, of course, that if I go, there's a bookshop quite near my office here. I mean, if I go in there, the chances are that my book won't be there, but Thomas Pakenham's will.
Right.
So I mean,
Exactly. Right.
my first response is just sheer envy. I think they can perpetuate old tropes, old
Right.
stereotypes, and I think I mean, Pakenham tells a wonderful story and he writes wonderfully, but Africans are very one-dimensional characters in it. He's not really into he's not writing for that audience. He's
Right.
he's writing for, ex-colonial types who want to discover, want to read about, Gordon's stand at Khartoum or whatever. So Africans kind of flit about in the background, not not being terribly interesting. I would say another gripe I would have about more popular histories is that they tend to kind of reinvent the wheel a bit. There's been some of that kind of stuff the last 10 years or so where people have written kind of wide-eyed accounts of Africans having kingdoms and amazing civilizations and stuff. Whereas, of course, professional historians, both in Africa and outside it, have known this for decades. I mean,
Sure.
we know this stuff, but the popular historians will tend to be, oh my gosh, look at this amazing kingdom that we've never heard of before. I mean, I've done sort of consultancy for TV people, and have complained at the titles that these programs tend to have. Mysteries of Africa or
The
Lost
Lost
Kingdoms.
Kingdoms or yeah.
Exactly, exactly.
Right.
And but I'm completely ignored whenever I say this. There's nothing lost about these kingdoms at all. But on the plus side, they do shift copy, they get read, and at their best, and I haven't actually yet got around to reading Howard French's book, but at their best, they can be real entry points for that elusive lay reader that often professional historians completely fail to capture because we don't write in the same way. Unfortunately, at least lots of
Sure.
professional historians tend not to write in that way.
Speaking of separate worlds, maybe this is the third rail to ask this question, but what are the lessons that you could see from your book that for policymakers, diplomats, business leaders engaging with Africa today,
Mm.
what are the practical lessons that emerged from your research?
That's a tough one. I mean, I've done quite a lot of policy oriented work in the past, particularly around Eritrea and Ethiopia. And that's quite straightforward policy wise, because you sort of say, look out for this faction, or, there are divisions in the government about, here's what might, I'm always wrong, by the way, but you sort of, you try to predict what might happen. And I kind of walked away from a lot of that stuff a few years ago, because I didn't personally find it very edifying anymore, and was boring myself. I mean, I found that I didn't have anything new to kind of say to them. So the short answer to that, Todd, is I don't really know, apart from the sort of asking people, I suppose, to keep in mind that periodization can
Right.
sometimes obscure more than it illuminates.
Mm,
And I think sometimes what happens is that people think about post-colonial Africa as though it was some kind of solid chunk of time that
right.
is inseparable from anything else. Um, and likewise, the notion of a pre-colonial, I think, is problematic. So I suppose in some ways for policy people, it's a very indirect attempt at impact, but to get them to think about, well, what are historical trajectories really like?
Right.
What do they mean to Africans themselves in terms of lived experience? I would also suggest possibly that if you use the long 19th century as an example, instability as an idea should not be judged by others' standards. One of the things that struck me when you look at the 19th century is you think things look pretty unstable and they're pretty volatile, but maybe that is a good thing at times. At times, it's necessary. And often, again, going back to my point earlier about warfare, is that that type of instability is too often misjudged by policy people, because they see it as the product of some kind of post-colonial dysfunction, rather than something that is historically actually
Mm.
quite important to the making and the remaking of African society.
Oh, I think that's a great takeaway. And I will use that as a lead into our last question. And I will say that actually the answer to this question, I asked it to one of our previous guests, Michelle Gavin, Ambassador Michelle Gavin from the Council on Foreign Relations. And her answer was your book, Shallow Graves, a memoir of sort of the Ethiopia Eritrea war. But what few books, I mean, again, saying what books would you recommend to understand African history? That's a silly question. But, what are two to three books that you would point people to who want to go a bit deeper into this, the long 19th century,
Yeah.
or maybe even just a neglected periods of African history? Somebody says, I'm fascinated by this. I've just taken your class and I want two or three more things that are not on the reading list. What would you say?
So I find this very tough as well, Todd.
Right. I
To
know
reduce
there's
this to
countless.
just two or three. I would suggest, if I may, I would suggest three books,
Go for it.
just because they kind of capture a lot of the stuff that is really interesting and a lot more in depth than I've been able to offer in this book. One is by Olufemi Taiwo, who is a US Nigerian professor of philosophy. I think he may be at like Cornell. And the book is How Colonialism Preempted Modernity in Africa. And I think it's just a really interesting exploration about what happens at bits of the 19th century. He's not solely interested in 19th
Right.
century, but he looks at sort of constitutionalism, experiments in political reform and stuff, particularly in the Gold Coast in West Africa. And it's just a really interesting way in to understanding what Africans are attempting to do in the 19th century. I would also recommend Michelle Moyd's book, Violent Intermediaries, a brilliant study of African military recruits in the German colonial army.
The Ascaris.
Yeah, the Ascaris, exactly.
Yeah.
And their role really in helping to forge what becomes German East Africa and ends up becoming, Tanganyika and Tanzania. And it's just a really interesting take on what happens in those closing years of the 19th century and the early 20th century. She really problematizes standard notions of how colonial states are built. The last one I'd recommend, because I'm more and more interested in emotions history, and it's a book by Joanna Lewis called Empire of Sentiment, and it's really about how imperial emotion was expressed in the years following David Livingstone's death, and the sort of myth making that was created around David Livingstone as a figure. She can lay claim, Joanna Lewis, to writing one of the first kind of properly emotions history accounts of the British Empire, and it's a really interesting way into thinking about public culture and public memory around this particular figure, Livingstone, of course, who's greatly celebrated. So that one is Empire of Sentiment, published about 7 or 8 years ago.
Oh, fantastic. We will put those in the show notes, and those are the first time that we've had any of those three recommended. Richard, I hate to have to wrap up, but I think we've reached our time here. The book is The African Revolution by Richard Reid, and it's available from Princeton University Press. And Richard, I can't thank you enough for joining us today and sort of talking about here, there, and everywhere. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure, Todd. Thank you very much for having me.